skies will be filled with the greatest air armada the world has ever seen. Our own Army Air Forces, the best planes ever built, 65,000 planes this year. And by the time you finish your training, America will have overwhelming superiority in the air.
Well, we're going to talk about, this is the opening act, okay? That's the main act right there, and it always is in the museum, is the airplanes, because that's what it's about. But we're going to do a little intro, hopefully 35, maybe 40 minutes. We're going to allow at least another 5, maybe 10 minutes afterwards for some Q&A. I'm going to stick around the museum until at least mid-afternoon, so if anybody wants to correct any mistakes I make or engage in some conversation, would be more than happy to do it. We're going to talk about the Avenger today and its role in the Battle of the Atlantic. All of these planes have long and illustrious histories during World War II. And we have a tendency to focus on sometimes one issue. The B-25, we talk about the Doolittle raid, and why wouldn't you? But again, the B-25 served in both theaters, did a lot of wonderful stuff. The P-38, we talk about the Yamamoto shoot down, but the P-38 again campaigned in both, etc. When we talk about torpedo bombers in general and our Avenger, we have a tendency to talk about its role as a very, very new entrant into the arsenal of carrier-based airplanes in the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. But these airplanes had a whole lot of other stuff that they did. In the U.S. Navy, I'm a Navy guy, so I'm obviously prejudiced. When you find a carrier-based plane that works, you have a tendency to keep it and get it to do a lot of stuff. And this is a perfect example of this. Designed as a torpedo bomber to carry this big Mark 13 one-ton torpedo and try to sink ships with it, but it was a good carrier-based airplane. Like a lot of Grumman planes, not the prettiest plane in the world, but boy, it was rugged, it flew well, it was not a hard plane, and we found jobs all over in both theaters for this airplane to do. And the Battle of the Atlantic that we're going to talk about today is one of those very, very important jobs, and a pretty interesting piece of history that a lot of people don't know about. Gene Pfeffer, who was our historian, found this picture, and it is a mural. I think any picture on a wall is a mural. It's a mural in the northeast corner of the pavilion by our other Avenger that tells the story of the Battle of the Atlantic. This is a collection of Avengers, 3 of them, and some Wildcats on VC. It's a combined squadron, so it uses dive bombers as well as fighters on a escort carrier, which is the smaller half-size Jeep carriers, baby flat tops they were called, in the spring of 1945 in the North Atlantic, kind of sweeping up the last of the U-Boat Peril. And it's a great picture. It tells a lot of different stories about war, about aviation in war, and life at sea. So I use it a lot when I do my tours, and it's going to be kind of what we're going to talk about today. This is a story of Jeeps, Fidos, string bags, and turkeys. And some of you may recognize those nicknames, what they apply to. I'm going to try to make sure that I mention them as we go through the presentation. But it tells a lot about how we name things. The Battle of the Atlantic isn't recognized along with the Battle of the Bulge and Guadalcanal and the invasion of Okinawa, etc., because it was at sea, and the battles took place at sea. The people who died at sea, and they was out of sight. So it wasn't particularly recognized except by the people who were running the war, and one of those is Winston Churchill, who said the only thing that ever really frightened him, which includes the Battle of Britain, Normandy, D-Day, etc., the only thing during the war that really frightened him was the U-Boat Peril, that they would be successful and they would choke off the supply of petroleum, of munitions, of food to Great Britain. It was the dominant factor in the world. It affected everything else. We couldn't get material. If we couldn't get munitions to Great Britain, we couldn't have invaded the mainland of Europe. We couldn't have concluded the war, etc. So Winston was right, and he placed a significant amount of use of resources on the Battle of Britain. It was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. It started on September 3rd, the day the war started in 1939, and ended on May 8th of 1945. So it was 5 years and 8 months of continuous warfare. Obviously, activities went up and down. Certain times the Allies were dominant, and a lot of times the Axis powers, the U-boat threat was dominant, but it was a long, long campaign. We paid a heavy price, both sides. Approximately 3,500 merchantmen were sunk. About 175 warships, primarily British, but also Canadian and U.S., were sunk. About 72 to 75,000 merchant seamen lost their lives. And they were from all countries. They were from Great Britain, the Commonwealth countries, the United States, but also foreign crews from all over the world lost their lives as part of the Battle of Britain. And that's why it's a nice round number of 72, 75,000 people, because we don't really know what the head count was of people who died as part of the Battle of Britain. About 783 U-boats were sunk. And the loss of about 3,000 of the U-boat, not U-boat bore, crews were killed, and that was represented about 75% of the U-boat crews lost their lives. So it was a dangerous job, but they wreaked havoc in terms of the Allies. This is a very simple summary of what the war was about. The blue line is the Allied merchant shipping lost. So one can see in the early part of the war, there was a lot of loss of merchant ships, and the red line is the number of U-boats lost. And so one can see the gradual decline of the effectiveness of U-boats, and that's pretty much what we're going to talk about today. Part of this process is that we usually review these presentations with Bill Clares and other members of the staff to kind of make sure that we're not totally blowing smoke. Of course, that doesn't work with me because I have a tendency to wander from the facts every once in a while, so please remind me. So Bill Clares, when we were looking at this thing last Thursday, said, "John, what's this big dip going on in the war?" And I said, "I'm not too sure." But one of the other people involved said, it's in January, so it was probably weather. And in fact, it was. The winter of 1942-43 was the wildest winter in the North Atlantic in over 50 years in terms of storms. And it reduced the effectiveness of the U-boat threat, so their productivity fell dramatically. But then they recovered fairly quickly, and they were still on a tear. And then in March was probably one of the worst months for the Allies. In March of 1943 was probably one of the worst months for the Allies of the Battle of the Atlantic. But then quickly it changed, and May and June become the black months, the dark months, and it was the nadir of their effectiveness. And from then on, the U-boat threat decreased, and essentially U-boat missions became suicide missions. And a great part of that story is that airplane. And we're so proud of having it here and being able to tell this story for you today. A lot of ships got sunk during World War II, but the North Atlantic is where the big casualties occurred. And that was because Great Britain was an island nation. It had to import everything. So when it was at war, it needed to import all of its fuel and all of its munitions. And The Kriegsmarine, which is the name for the German Navy at that time, they had a theory that if they could win the tonnage war, they could sink more tonnage, the size of a ship, more tonnage of ships than the Allies could manufacture. They could force Great Britain and the United States to the negotiating table. They did not labor under the illusion that they could invade Britain and win the war that way, but they felt as though if they could choke Britain and the imports, they could sue for peace, and they might be right. So the activities in the North Atlantic was kind of where the U-boat threat was. It gives you an idea, kind of a poor map, but it gives you some idea. Great Britain was importing primarily to Liverpool munitions, food, and petroleum from America, the Americas, primarily North America and Canada, but also into Murmansk to arm and help our allies at that time in the Soviet Union. So most of the convoys originated in Nova Scotia or Newfoundland and continued up along with the Gulf Stream into Northern Ireland or Liverpool or into Scotland, and then be disseminated into Great Britain. So this was where the battle was fought, in the North Atlantic. And in terms of weather, it's one of the toughest places in the world to operate. Who was involved? Karl Dönitz was the guy who organized the U-boat fleet and was the mastermind behind it. His boss for a while was Erich Rieder, and he was a more traditional sailor, believed in battleships and cruisers, etc. Karl, on the other hand, felt as though, given enough submarines, he could choke Great Britain into submission, and he came darn close to it. This gives you a little idea of, this was the losses, U-boat losses, through the war. So through 1930, the little bit of 1930, 39, 40, 41, etc., they were operating very effectively, and we hadn't come up with the solution of how to stop them. And they were very, very effective. And then suddenly, in 1943, something changed. And part of what we're going to talk about today is that airplane was part of that something, and a very effective part of it. The war began in 39. Early on, the day of the war began, one of the U-boats sank, the Athenia, U-30 sank the Athenia. It was a passenger liner, had about 50 U.S. citizens who lost their lives. And again, this was before we had entered the war in Pearl Harbor, so it was almost the catalyst that got us to declare war against the Third Reich. U-boats invaded Scapa Flow, which was a safe harbor, quote, safe harbor off the northern coast of Scotland, and sank several ships, and to the great consternation of Winston Churchill, who at that time was the first Sea Lord. He was not Prime Minister quite at that time. The U-boats also had a big windfall when in May of 1940, France fell, because prior to that, they were operating out of bases in Germany, primarily Hamburg and Kiel, and they had a long and dangerous transit around Great Britain to get to the North Atlantic. When France fell, they were able to take these U-boat bases and move them down to the Bay of Biscay, and then they had a straight shot into the North Atlantic. So the fall of France was critical to the war, but was also very critical. One other aside that just makes some sense for this particular slide is when we think of the Battle of the Atlantic, we think, and correctly so, primarily in the North Atlantic, the transit routes between North America, Great Britain, and Murmansk. But there were other activities. There was some activity off of the African coast, and this was primarily imports coming from India, one of the Commonwealth countries, to Great Britain. But there is this big, big lunk of sunk ships. And I said, why is that happening? Well, what is happening here is Venezuela at that time, the late 1930s and 40s, had the largest known petroleum reserves. It was before we understand where all the oil was in Saudi Arabia. So Venezuela and its surrounding islands, Curacao, etc., were a source of petroleum, of crude oil, but also petroleum products. So the U-boats went down, and this is all oil tankers, either crude tankers going to the U.S. refineries in the Gulf Coast, or petroleum product tankers going over to Great Britain. So when we talk about the Battle of the Atlantic, we usually think of the North Atlantic, and that's generally a pretty good way to start, but there was activity all over the Atlantic. The U-boats were a very underestimated threat. The British had developed the first generation of sonar, and they felt as though that would make the waters transparent, and they could operate with immunity because they could always see the submarine and blow it up. But of course, that was not the case. Atmospherics, sound in the water column, lack of qualified operators made sonar a useful tool, but it wasn't the be-all and end-all. So the U-boat threat was very, very effective in the latter half of 1940 into 1941. We think mostly about what we call the Enigma machines and the effort by the Allies, primarily the British, in decoding the German ciphers and codes. But the Third Reich had a very effective signals intelligence effort called BDINS. It's a long German word that I can't pronounce. But they were reading the Royal Navy's naval code for almost the entire war. And so they knew what the Royal Navy was doing. We knew what the convoys were doing and how they were being organized. And they deployed wolf packs, that is, groups of anywhere between 6 to as many as 12 submarines, deployed across the expected path of the convoys, and they became very, very effective. They used aircraft, and they were able to thwart the threat of sonar and, to a certain extent, high-frequency direction finding. The Allies, Great Britain, used high-frequency direction finding to listen to the radio traffic from the U-boats. They couldn't understand what they were saying, but they could triangulate and find out where the submarines were. So HFDUF, as it was called, high-frequency direction finding, became very, very effective. And this whole story of radio and radar and other sorts of things show the importance of technology and the very rapid development of technology on the Allied side in terms of turning the tide using that airplane. One shortcoming of the Wolfpack was very, very effective. It was a plan that Karl Dönitz had come up with when he was a prisoner of war after World War I, is that it generated a gob of radio traffic. So Karl himself was a bit of controlling personality, and he wanted to know where everybody was at all times. So it was a very chatty sort of way to wage war. And chatting generates radio traffic. Radio traffic is a perfect example of a way to deploy technology to find out where your enemy is and what they're planning to do. These are some examples of some of the big submarine bends along the Bay of Biscay in France that still exist. They were bombed and bombed and bombed and then were bombed again. And no one could come through the concrete, and they existed and still exist. I don't know if anybody goes there as tourists. I know there was a tourist business for going to the beaches at Normandy. I'm not too sure there was any to go to the old submarine pens. Through 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic turns into kind of a grind it out. The convoys are now organized. They're coming across the Atlantic, and the U-boats are being deployed, and it's just grinding it out one after the other. U-boats are experiencing significant losses because the escorts are pretty effective. but they still lack one of the big and major tools, and that is air coverage. So we engaged in this tonnage war, where simply we're trying to manufacture more ships and put more goods in them and saturate the offense that the U-boats have established across the North Atlantic. The Germans called them their happy times. When things go well for them, that is, the Allies' defenses fall apart for some reason or other, they have a happy time. And in 1942, which was right after we have entered the war, remember December 7, 1941, we enter the war. So from January to June of 1942, the U-boats have their second happy time, because they realize if they can forward to deploy to the east coast of the United States, it's a shooting gallery. We have no understanding of the U-boat threat. So we don't have a pipeline that runs petroleum from the Gulf Coast refineries to the Northeast where we use it. So we send tankers up and down the East Coast. And because we lacked a civil defense philosophy, all of the shorelines were lit up. Atlantic City, Miami, New York City, big ports. So the U-boats could sit off the East Coast and just sink tankers with immunity, and they did that. And it created a very happy time for the U-boats. And it took us almost the better part of 6 months to wake up to realize that there was a threat out there and we needed to do something about it. As simple as having blackouts of the lights. So our ships weren't silhouetted. The U-boat fleet was able to do this forward deployment because they had what they call milk cows. These were large submarines. They were not combatants. They were simply supply submarines. And so the U-boats would deploy to the East Coast, and they were able to stay there because the milk cows would come to them and deliver new torpedoes as well as fuel and food. But in doing that, they generated a lot of radio traffic, which gave us the opportunity to find out where they were going and what they were going to do there. July 42 to about February of 43, again, most of the fleets, after the U.S. kind of wised up to what they needed to do in terms of civil defense on the East Coast, the U-boats return into the mid-Atlantic, and are pretty successful for a couple of reasons. There was a big black pit in the North Atlantic where there was no air coverage. So right now we were relying primarily, exclusively on land-based planes from Great Britain, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia. And when you do the radius of operation of airplanes, you find out there's a big black pit in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and that's where the U-boats went. And they were very, very successful. On the other hand, the Royal Navy appointed a new guy in commander of the Western approaches by the name of Max Horton, who was a terror. And he was very effective. He was a very adamant trainer, and he was a very good campaigner for resources, most airplanes and other sorts of material. The U-boat fleet, on the other hand, had developed a thing called METOX, which was a simple radar receiver. So it could receive the signals being broadcast by ship-based and airplane radar and avoid them. And it was successful for a while until we started miniaturizing the radio and changed the frequency that was being used, and then they didn't work at all. The Enigma machine, which was the primary machine that the Third Reich used, but clearly the Kriegsmarine used, usually had 3 wheels that generated a code. And so in this time period, in late 42 and early 43, the Third Reich put a 4th wheel, and it made the Enigma machines, the special intelligence coming from the Enigma machines, unreadable for a period of about 6 months. So the black pit, the lack of Enigma coverage, and some good defensive electronics on the U-boat side made this a pretty good time for the U-boats. This is Max Horton, really an interesting character. Very few people know anything about him, unlike the Allied generals, Patton and Montgomery. on the Army side and the admirals in the Pacific. We don't know much. We don't hear much about Max, but he was very, very effective and was probably one of the reasons that we were able to win the Battle of the Atlantic. This is a picture of, shows the North Atlantic and this big black pit of lack of air coverage, which was a very, very dangerous place to be. Finally, in March of '43, things start going very badly for our friends in the U-boat business. Because of some very effective work by the U-boats in late January, February, and the beginning of March, it was the low point for the British because their supply of petroleum had gone down to below 60 days. And they're at war, and they only have 60 days of fuel and gasoline, etc. But there was an increase. Max Horton increased the number of escort vessels for the convoys, and the U-boats start to lose the battle. And in May, it's the worst time, and the number of lives lost and submarines lost to the U-boats become to the point where they really can't operate effectively. And in the final years of the battle, from June '42 to the end, again, U-boat missions became nearly suicide missions. They were taking such terrible losses. And a lot of that, those losses have to do with this airplane that we're talking about today. A couple of simple but very demonstrative figures here. This is Allied losses, creeps up to a high point where we start getting Enigma, that is signals intelligence, and then we get radar being installed, miniaturized, to the point where it can be installed on ships and airplanes, and then we suddenly see Allied losses go down dramatically, and conversely, we see the U-boat losses go up as the time progresses. So it's an interesting story. Karl Dönitz, quite an interesting character, very effective leader, very effective strategizer. He was also a suck-up. He really sucked up to Hitler. And Hitler liked people who sucked up to him. So anyway, at the end of the war, Goering thought he was going to be after Hitler commits suicide. There's only about 2 weeks of being the guy in charge, the Führer. But Goering thought he was going to be it. But actually, Karl Dönitz is appointed the Führer, and he's in charge of the place for about a week and a half before he has to surrender. He's tried at Nuremberg. This is his mugshot. He's tried at Nuremberg and convicted, but not convicted as a war criminal. So he was not executed. He served 10 years in prison and got out of prison in kind of the mid-1950s and got a pension because he had been a Navy admiral. I think he died in the early to mid-60s, but quite a character. But he did escape the hangman's noose. We're going to be talking a little bit about technologies. We talked about HFTUF, high-frequency direction finding. It was hugely effective, especially the fact that the U-boats used a lot of radio traffic. So it helped us. We couldn't understand what they were saying, but we knew where they were when they were saying it. And we were able to steer our convoys around some of the U-boat presence. There was a land-based system, but there was also a miniaturized, so we started putting radio direction finders on ships, so the escort vessels for the convoys could listen to or hear the submarines talking on radio and be able to be vectored towards them. Signals intelligence was very important. Again, we talk about the Enigma machines from the Royal Navy, but also the Beat-In system for Kriegsmarine. And it seems to be a common factor that we're very proud of the fact that we're listening and understanding the other guy's stuff, but we don't ever remember that we didn't seem to clue up to the fact that they're listening to ours. So we didn't change our codes anywhere frequently, and we seem to think that somehow we were superior to our enemy, so how could they be able to listen to our radio traffic? And that sort of attitude was pretty common for both the Kriegsmarine as well as the Royal Navy, and the U.S. too. That's an Enigma machine. These are the the 3 wheels that are set. Every day there's a new set of codes that are coded into the wheels, and the odds of being able to read these codes were dramatically different. Were dramatically high. There's a couple of very good movies about the Enigma machines, and there's a fair amount of attention paid to it. But the most important aspect was radar. Radar had been developed early in the late 20s, 30s, but nobody ever used it particularly well. The British deployed it in their home chain system, which helped them detect the Luftwaffe as they came over in the Battle of Britain. But that was very low frequency, long wavelength radar, that the antennas of which were as big as this building. So they were not appropriate or could not be installed on ships or airplanes. And then finally, they developed a thing called the cavity magnetron, of which you all have at least one in your microwave oven at home. And that enabled us to generate much shorter wavelength, higher frequency radar that had smaller antennas, and we were able to mount them on ships and onto planes. And a review after the war done by the Royal Navy with cooperation of what remained of the U-boat forces in Germany credited radar, specifically aircraft radar, being the largest single factor in the demise of the whole U-boat system. So this is this is an Avenger with the Yagi antenna array. So this is one of the very first generations of airborne radar. We have one here in the museum, and it's mounted on the Dauntless, which you should go and see, but it was more common to see it mounted on our Avengers. I believe the next generation of airplane that was a carrier-based airplane that used airborne radar was the Helldiver, which is behind that screen in restoration, and Bill tells me that they at least, I think, have antennas from a radar system, because that airplane also had some of this first generation of radar. It advanced very, very quickly, but a good portion of what the story is about the Avenger relates to its use of radar. It was a relatively simple system, had an effective range of about 60 miles for something really big, like an aircraft carrier or the shore of the shore of an island. It had an effective range for about 8 to 15 miles for the sail of a submarine on the surface. It was installed on the SBD, the Dauntless, as we said, the TBF, the Avenger, but also on the Catalinas. But it required the early versions required a 2-person aircraft because it needed to have its own separate operator. It was very primitive, didn't have a lot of useful functionality built into it, so there was a lot of operator skill involved. So the young sailor who was originally put in these airplanes to be a radio operator and maybe a gunner, had to go back to radar school, and it was a very difficult course because learning how to operate these very simple radars was very difficult. This is the repeater, it's a simple oscilloscope. There's no intelligence involved in it, and we're very happy to have one on our Dauntless here. And if anybody ever wants to come on up afterwards, you can find one of our first generation cavity magnetrons. This is dates from about 1942. I think it was built by a Western Electric, and it is my proud contribution to our collection of electronic warfare memorabilia. Radar was also mounted on the Catalina. The Catalina is part of this story of the North Atlantic also, and part of the story of the use of radar. League lights were big flash, the big spotlights that we used to light up the submarine on the surface. It was required because the Royal Navy's version of radar lost resolution as you got close. So under 1,000 yards, it was not particularly useful. So we had these big League lights, which were pretty broad beam spotlights to light up the submarine and set them up for attacks. One thing that I didn't know that existed very much during World War II was sonobuoys. Sonobuoys are used in hunting submarines. They are dropped from the airplane. They have usually a microphone, a hydrophone, that then lowers down on a wire 50 to 100 feet into the water column and listens for signals, takes that and broadcasts those signals back to the airplane. And by laying a line of them across the anticipated track of a submarine, you can isolate where they are. Relatively advanced technology, but it used by this airplane in 1943, 1945. So if you take a look at that first picture that I pulled up there, which showed the Avengers on board the escort carrier in the North Atlantic, it had sonobuoys on it. We used a homing torpedo, which a lot of people don't realize that we had. It was designed specifically for aerial-based submarine hunting. So it was not used by submarines, it was not used by surface ships, it was not designed to sink surface ships. But the frustration was, as people who were flying this Avenger came on to where the submarine should have been, all they would see was the wake. The submarine had, when hearing the airplane, had decided to submerge. Very good thing to do. As soon as the submarine is down below the surface, as little as 20, 30 feet, you immediately make a 90-degree turn right or left. So if I'm in an airplane, I can see the wake, but I don't know where the submarine is. But these little homing torpedoes, they're about the third of the size of this Mark 13 torpedo. They would be able to be dropped in the wake. They would go active, and they would listen for the submarine sound of the propellers. And they had didn't have a big warhead, but they had enough to bend a propeller or break a rudder and disable the submarine. So they were very effective. Sank about 60 submarines in both theaters. They were used in the Pacific a little bit, but in the North Atlantic, they were very effective when dropped from the Avenger or from the Catalina. Cool piece of technology that was developed relatively quickly. Surface ships use decoys. We also started the use of forward-firing rockets. These Avengers had 50 caliber machine guns mounted on them. They weren't particularly effective. If you spray, or the Wildcats that flew with them had 50 calibers also, you could spray the deck of a submarine and do some damage and destroy anti-aircraft guns, but you couldn't penetrate the pressure hull of a submarine with the 50 cal. So these rockets were designed by Caltech, and they were mounted on the underwing of an airplane. The original versions that the Navy asked for did not have any explosive warheads. Those are just big bullets on the end of the thing. But the rocket would have a velocity of about 400 to 450 miles an hour. So there was a lot. This was a 20-pound bullet. So 20 pounds times that velocity, it was a lot of energy. They could penetrate the pressure hull of a submarine. And we were sinking submarines with these forward-firing rockets. Later on, the Army says, hey, those are kind of cool. So they started putting explosive warheads on them, and they started using them in Europe for busting up rail yards and other sorts of things, and they were very effective. But remember, they started out with the Navy. As an example of an Avenger with several of these rockets on it. But we did start using hunter-killer groups. So in the early part of the war, the warships were focused on protecting the convoys. So if they found a submarine and they drove the submarine away, the ships that were protecting the convoy would not chase the submarine. They would stay with the convoy, which is what they were supposed to do. But later on in the war, we started developing and building more of the Jeep escort carriers and combatants. So we started deploying these hunter-killer groups with the convoys, and then they would go off and chase the submarines. So that's why once you get past 43 through 44, it becomes such a dangerous place for U-boats because of these hunter-killer groups and these airplanes that flew off the carriers. Did a lot of land-based aviation. The B-24, the consolidated B-24 bomber, had several versions that were used in maritime patrol. Some were simply just longer range extensions, and then some of them were specific. The Privateer was specifically a B-24 that was developed specifically for the Navy, and for some reason or other, the Navy just liked one vertical stabilizer as opposed to the two. The British had a wonderful airplane called the Fairey Swordfish. It sank the Bismarck. You may remember that movie and the song from the 60s, To Sink the Bismarck. Well, it was the Swordfish flying off of one of the Royal Navy's carriers that sank the Bismarck. And they flew all through World War II as their torpedo bomber. They put radar on them. But it is just an old, crummy old biplane. Remember, a lot of times you don't need to go fast. You just need to be able to hang around a long time. It was known as the string bag for very good reasons, because it looked as though it was held together mostly by string. Couple more. We're going to wrap up here. A couple more photos of the Avenger. Here's a great picture of an Avenger. This is being loaded with a Mark 13 torpedo. But also, there is a technician who is getting ready to mount the antenna for the radar on it. So it's kind of a neat picture that shows how this airplane was modified for all kinds of different jobs. The feature that makes this airplane so useful and gives it so many other lives besides torpedo bombing of ships is this huge bomb bay that we have. And we could fit one of these, but then a whole bunch of other sort of munitions. This is an interesting picture because it has one of the Fido torpedoes. So this is one of that acoustic homing torpedo, but then also several depth charges. This is a picture of 2 depth charges plus an array of sonar buoys and a void space in the center where that Fido torpedo will go. So that big bomb bay that served us well in the Battle of Midway by hauling around these Mark 13s made it a very, very useful carrier-based bomber. Tells the story of George Herbert Walker Bush bombing Chichijima, but also tells a story of this airplane in the Battle of the Atlantic and how this airplane contributed greatly to that victory. A lot of good stuff to read on this. If you're interested in, I love reading stuff. There is a very good recent movie, 2019 movie called Greyhound, which is the story of the Battle of the Atlantic, a very personal story of the Battle of the Atlantic that makes for good viewing. And there is a lot of very good books on the subject. We're proud to have the Avenger. Its story here today is the Battle of the Atlantic, but remember, it has a whole bunch of other stories. That's one thing about Navy carrier-based planes. When you get one and it works, you keep it around and you give it a whole bunch of other jobs, and there's a lot of those stories in the museum. Thank you very much. I'm ready to take some questions if you all have any. Sir.
Got one over here, John.
Okay, I'm going to start with him first, and we'll get to you.
Numbers of escort carriers in the Atlantic that the U.S. Navy had?
We built a whole bunch of escort carriers because they were nothing but Liberty ships with flat decks. So we could crank them out like a son of a gun. The first customer for a lot of Liberty ships were actually the Royal Navy. So there were hundreds of them built, and they served pedestrian sort of things, just hauling airplanes back and forth to Europe and to the Pacific. A head count between the Royal Navy, how many escort carriers were built here in the U.S.? I'm going to throw out a number and say it was probably about 130. I do some summer up in Maine, and we had 2 shipyards in Portland, Maine, that generated Liberty ships. It was relatively small small shipyards, and they, I think, built a total of about 75 right there. So between the Kaiser yards on the West Coast, between Liberty ships and Victory ships, there were a lot of them, and building escort carriers versus building the big attack carriers were pretty simple. They were nothing but essentially Liberty ships with a flat deck on top of them. Not a real true answer, but gives you some idea of the scope of how many there were. And everybody appreciates all of the Essex-class carriers and all of the war in the Pacific, but the day-to-day drudgery of just hauling stuff and chasing submarines that were done by the escort carriers is another, if not untold, at least greatly underappreciated story of the U.S. Navy and the British Navy during World War II. Did we have somebody in back? Did somebody take that man's question?
Yeah. Your charts that showed the ups and downs of your successes. When was the Enigma machine captured in relative to
when was the what?
The Enigma machine.
The Enigma machines. Again, there's several. One of the first ones was a British destroyer. They used to call them their destroyers corvettes. And I think it was a corvette. Could have been a Royal Canadian corvette. And they captured one relatively early in the war, in about 42-ish, I think. So that gave the people who were trying to understand how these codes were generated, so that's how they generated. It did not help them with the daily changing of the wheel codes. So it was a big help to the people in Bletchley Park who were doing the decoding. But the Brits captured one, a U.S. destroyer captured one, and by the end of the war, there were several of them in captivity, so we kind of knew how they worked. But simply getting the machine didn't solve the decoding problem. Make any sense? Okay.
I got one over here.
Yes.
You briefly mentioned surface ships using decoys. Would
Yes.
you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, I went over that. It was the Royal Navy did them mostly because relatively late in the war, 43, 44-ish, the Kriegsmarine developed a submarine-based acoustic homing torpedo. So it was a big torpedo like this. And it was mainly, the main target was surface ships. And it's mostly surface warfare, warships. That's what they were trying to sink with it. So the Brits came up with a wire-towed decoy that did tow behind them by about 100 yards, and it would make a whole lot of noise that was supposed to sound like a ship and distract the homing torpedo. I don't think there were many used in the U.S., at least not in World War II. Later on, in the Cold War, we had a lot of decoys, etc., and nowadays it's a whole subset of submarine warfare as decoys. But the Royal Navy did the one. That was a picture of a Royal Navy, either a destroyer or a corvette, and they were wire-towed.
You mentioned that early in the war, the U-boats came right up to the East Coast, and
Yes.
I know there were groups at some point. They mobilized Civil Air Patrol and other groups for coastal patrol. How effective were they and with their interface with the military, et cetera?
Not at all, and none. There's some great stories. I think Ernest Hemingway might have been part of. I mean, the government was appropriating anything that they could find that would float and had a motor on it. So a lot of rich kids from Long Island would go and serve on these things, and they were not effective at all. There was no training involved. The Navy reluctantly gave them pistols. And mostly they ended up shooting themselves or holes in the boat. So be a little cavalier about it, but it was not particularly effective. The Civil Air Patrol, again, they were trying, but there was really no training, and there was no real communication systems. The story is somewhat apocryphal, probably, was that they would report a submarine. They would see a submarine periscope 6 miles away. That would never happen. You cannot see that. You're lucky to see a submarine periscope about 500 yards away. So there was a lot of running around responding, and the active duty military got retired of the whole thing. Or the chief of naval operations, Ernest King, who was probably one of the meanest people in the world, had very, very little patience for this. FDR, on the other hand, thought it was probably the way to win the war. If he could just get all of his rich friends from Long Island to get out there in their boats, they'd be able to find and sink the submarines. Well, it really didn't work that way. It's an interesting story, and it's a very interesting piece. The simple fact of developing a civil defense system where we shut off lights at night made the biggest difference. The documentation of U-boat commanders coming in through past Montauk Point and down into Long Island, they were sitting there, just their jaws were dropping, how lit up the shore was and how effective it was in silhouetting ships. And they were just, popping off and sinking them right one after another. It was their second happy time. Sorry.
I disagree, John. I think when I was bad, when I was young, my dad was the meanest person in the world.
So what I've got is my uncle Robert was a merchant marineman during the war. He was age 14. He'd left home from Oklahoma. And my dad said he would come home with wads of cash because he was paid enormous amounts of money to ride on those merchant marines up and down the East Coast of the United States and survived.
Yeah, it was, and there's a whole story about the Merchant Marine because they gave their lives, U.S. members of the Merchant Marine, British Canadians, but also a lot of foreign crews. A lot of these were foreign flag vessels, and we really don't even have a number of how many, but it was a dangerous business, and there's a lot of hard ways to die, but one of them is freezing to death in the North Atlantic in the middle of February. Sir. Yes.
How accurate is the movie 571?
The question is how accurate are the movies made? And you talk about a specific one about the Enigma machine. They're actually pretty accurate. It's a movie, so you gotta understand that. But the story is a compelling one, and the people, the personalities, make for a great movie. So I can't say I looked at it with any critical eye, but it's entertaining and it is relatively factual.
Okay, on the Enigma machine, the first one was actually captured in 1939 by the Poles and smuggled to England. You can find a lot of information on Enigma through the book called The Bodyguard of Lies.
Okay.
But my question has to deal with the Yehudi project.
Which one now?
The Yehudi
Okay,
project.
now I'm going into... This is where I feel very comfortable, stuff I don't know anything about.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I know they put them on... They did it on Wildcats originally, and I think they did it on some of these, where they took the leading edges of the aircraft and put spotlights on them.
Oh, interesting.
And they had a rheostat in the back so they could adjust it to the background light behind the aircraft to make the aircraft invisible to the U-boat crews when they were diving on them.
I never heard that story at all. And Alan, and do you remember? This is, can you and I chat later on? I'm fascinated by this. I've never heard that story. Yehudi. Great name. It's true. Okay. How we doing in time-wise? You want to wrap this up?
We're okay.
I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about naval blimps and their effect on this. And a second question, what was the frequency of the radar on this aircraft?
Let me ask the second one first. These were described as centimetric radars. So they would be somewhere between 8 and 10 centimeters. So like that. I can't do in my head wavelength to frequency conversion. You're going to have to do that. I can't. But that gives you some idea what the wavelength was. But that was important because that defined the radar, the antenna size, but also defined its resolution and a whole bunch of other things. But that was the big invention of the cavity magnetron and the Tezard committee that came. There was a whole bunch of story about that, and that, which is a 1942 cavity magnetron. I bought that on eBay for about $30. And it's missing a big horseshoe magnet that we can't bring in here because those cars would be pulled over towards them. so we can't do that. But anyway, if you want to see a real artifact, come on up and you can say you touched one of these things, because they're pretty rare. So that was the first question. It was they were about 8 to 10 centimeter wavelength. What was the first question?
Would you talk about naval blimps and their effect on the...
The only thing I know about naval blimps, I was in a reserve unit with a guy who was a blimp pilot. And they operated, the big blimp base was in Lakehurst, New Jersey. They still have the big dirigible hangars, because originally we were using dirigibles, which had aluminum frames, etc. The blimps were more balloon bags. But we used them on the East Coast relatively effectively as part of those patrol squadrons. I think the Navy was out of the blimp business by clearly the late 50s. I think Lakehurst is still a very active naval air station, but I think we got out of the blimp business. But I did know a guy in the reserves. Navy squadrons, our fixed-wing squadrons are V, so that airplane would be VT, and our helicopter is H. The blimp squadrons started with the letter Z, so Z53 or whatever it is, you know. But I understand they were hard to drive because they'd be kind of going up and down. But I don't know too much about them, but I know they were part of the coastal defense. You couldn't go too far with them. What I know about blimps. Okay. I have some commonality with blimps. So I'm full of hot air. They use night. But anyway, go on. We
got you weighted down with your shoes. Any other questions?
Okay, I'll be around here for a while, and then I'll be around the museum most of the day, so I'd be more than happy to chat with you. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for some very, very good questions. Appreciate it. Alan's going to talk about the airplane, which is the star of the show, and so is Alan.
Not really. Hi, folks. Thanks for coming out this morning. Sorry we won't get to fly for you. Visibility's kind of down, and the temperature's down, and that just brings the motivation down to go fly one of these things. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit this morning real briefly about the military history on this airplane and a little bit of the civilian history, and then I'll turn it over to my partner Bill, and he can tell you a little story about one of the fellows that owned this airplane before we got it. So it's a TBM 3E built by General Motors, assuming in Linden, New Jersey. It's bureau number 91453, and the FAA registration is 4170 Alpha. So the 3E designation, it just had a stronger airframe. It would have had the search radar on it with a radome under the right wing, and the ventral gun would have been deleted. And they built 646 of that model, TBM 3Es. It was delivered to the Navy in August of 1945, so it's a pretty late airframe. Various assignments with the Navy, NAS Norfolk, Corpus Christi, Kingsville, etc. In June of 1948, it was overhauled by the Navy. After, it had a total of 1,600 hours total flight time on it. Kind of an interesting thing I just learned about the airplane a couple weeks ago from our partner Chris Johnson on the East Coast. In about the 1948-49 time frame, it was on the USS Princeton, which is an Essex-class carrier. It was with VA 135, which their nickname was the Uninvited. And that squadron started out as VT-81 in 1941, then redesignated VA 14A in November of 46, and finally VA 135 in August of 48. The interesting thing about this was the commander of that squadron at the time this airplane was on the Princeton was a guy named Albert K. Ernest. He went by the name Bert, and he was a CO of the VA 135. The story about him is he was the other sole survivor of the Battle of Midway. He was the only TBM that launched out of Midway that actually made it back to Midway. He was the only one. So he potentially could have flown this airplane, which is kind of a cool little thing to know about for that. So that's about the biggest highlight for its military history. It was stricken from the Navy inventory in July of 1956 with a total, like I say, 1,600 total flying hours, and it was overhauled just previously in 48. And that was surplused out at probably at NAS Norfolk in Virginia. So this is where the civilian history comes in. It was purchased by Reeder Flying Service in Twin Falls, Idaho, in 1957, and they operated 11 TBMs as fire bombers, and they actually did some ag spraying, believe it or not, with these things. And I'll get through this really quick here. In about 1981, after these were retired, a guy named Gary Wolverton in Kimberly, Idaho, I believe bought the entire inventory of what Reeder Flying Service had and all the parts and pieces. Because these things, when they come out of the military, they get modified. They take all the military stuff out, the turrets, the bomb bay doors come off, they put a tank in the bomb bay, and all the GI stuff comes out. That probably was on a pile. When he bought the pile of stuff, he probably put the bomb doors back on it, the turret back in it, and made it a little more military for, warbird kind of flying. And that's in 1981. And I think he had 3 or 4 that he actually got flying out of that inventory of stuff. When it was a tanker, and I haven't found a picture of it, Reeder Flying Service is still in existence. I think they're an FBO up there in Twin Falls, and I'd like to really kind of get a hold of them and see if they have any history or the family has history about it, but find a picture of it when it was in tanker service. So in 1984, Wolverton sold it to Jim Williams in Berkeley, California, and a friend of ours, Mike Bogue, who's passed away now, he used to take care of the airplane for Jim Williams. About 1995, Williams sold it to J.R. Carson in Santa Barbara, California, who Bill will talk about here in a minute. And then about 1997, Bill, myself, and Chris Johnson got the airplane from Jack Carson, who's a great friend of ours, and Bill will tell you that story. So it came out of the military, had 1,600 hours on it. Today it has about 4,300, almost 4,400 total time on the airframe. And the engine is not the original engine, of course, but it's got about 340 hours on it. So it's a little rough around the edges. It's not fully restored by any means, but it's a solid flying TBM, and we're happy to have it and show it off to you guys. So sorry we couldn't fly today, but we'll at least make an attempt to get it out and run it for you guys, and fold the wings and open them and close bomb bay doors. Do what we can do out there if you guys are up for that. If not, that's fine too. So that's about all I got for it. So no walk around today, but if you guys have questions, we'll be here all morning, and I'll happy to answer any questions you guys have. And if you didn't get up on the top, go check out the cockpit and what it's like in there. So thanks again for coming out, and I'll hand it off to Bill, and he'll tell his little story about it. So thanks, guys.
Okay, so as you know, the museum has 2 TBMs. If you don't, you need to go through. You'll find the other one in the pavilion. Like Alan said, this is a little more worn out, but it's not. The other airplane's got a really pretty paint job on it. This is really a better structural airplane. It's a lot faster, but it's our airplane. So the thing about it is, if you look on the side of the airplane, it says J.R. Carson. J.R. Carson, who's that? Anybody know? Jack Carson. It's John Reese Carson is his original name, but we call him Jack. So if you know a little bit about our history, I was honored to be able to fly my B-25 off of the carrier in 1992. Well, in 1995, because of that relationship with the Navy was looking to do the 50th anniversary of the World War II, and they wanted to do it in Hawaii. So they got a hold of us, and they asked us, hey, can you put a group of people together? And we said, oh, it's impossible. Nobody will want to fly off a carrier. But we were able to put 12 people that really wanted to go fly off of a carrier. And so we put an armada of people together, and the Navy said, there's only one thing you have to do. And we said, what's that? And they said, well, there's a guy that owns a TBM, lives out of Santa Barbara, California. He's a World War II veteran, flew these off of carriers in World War II, and we want him to fly the airplane off of the carrier. Okay, well, who's that? What's Jack Carson? Well, being Alan, my brothers, we've been flying the air show circuit forever, and we know it's an old guy that every time he shows up to an air show, he scares everybody. So, okay, well, if that's what we have to do, that's what we have to do. So we meet up with this guy, Jack Carson, shows up in his TBM. We go, everybody goes out to qualify. We go up to Alameda where we're going to launch the airplanes out, or on the Carl Vinson. And we go to do qualifications. So everybody gets out there, and you got to take off in about 450, 550, 600 feet, depending on the airplane. So we get out in a B-25, and we're out in 650 feet. Everybody is 650. Get down to the TBMs, and Jack, because he flew them, and because he's older, he's in his late 60s, I think, about that time, decides he's going to show these young kids how to take off of a carrier. Well, this airplane, you can only do about 32, 34 inches without it having the tail tied down, because it puts out so much thrust, it'll raise the tail. So Jack gets it out, gets it up to 30 inches, and he says, all right, I gotta beat everybody off. And he takes it, he runs it up to about 34 inches, thing comes up, hits the prop. Oh, no, here we go. This is why we didn't want to deal with Jack, because Jack doesn't do things smart. He just does whatever Jack thinks he wants to do, or at least that's what we think. So we go out and we're looking at this prop, and we're going, well, Jack, you're not going to make the qualifications. We're in Alameda, so right around the corner is California Airframe, so the next day we go over to California Airframe and we buy another whole prop. It was pretty expensive. The blades were $300 a piece, and I think the hub and the dome was, I think, $1,500. But we didn't have time to put it together because we have to load airplanes when we're getting ready to go. So the Navy comes out to us and says, hey, we really want Jack to go on this, and we're all going, well, now we've met him, we know him, he's a pretty cool guy. So we're not going to fly the airplane. If you know anything about carriers, when carrier comes into port, you know what they do? They always have an airplane on it. So they call it a dud. The dud is a plane that doesn't really fly, but they put it up there so when they come in and when they go out, and all the guys are out there and they're saluting, it looks really kind of cool. So Jack's plane became the dud. So we go over to Hawaii. We got 12 airplanes, but we only launch 11 because Jack's can't fly. So we come back to Alameda after we do that, and it was a pretty cool week. I think we spent, Chevron's money, we spent 20,000 gallons of fuel in 1 week just flying around doing all kinds of commemoration stuff. Come back, and now 3 months later, we're going to do it again. We're going to fly off of the carrier. Now we're going to do it in Alameda, 50th anniversary of the end of World War II commemorations. Jack goes out and qualifies. Everything's set. We put all the airplanes on the carrier again, and we're going to go out and we're going to fire these things up as we go through the Golden Gate, underneath the Golden Gate. And they got all these news people up there. We're all out there in our shorts in Alameda, and as we get on and the carrier starts going around, the fog starts coming in. It's colder than hell. And next thing you know, we're all firing up. We're getting ready to get there. Jack goes to fire up his airplane, and it's so cold now that the oil was so cold, it blew a hose off of it. Jack doesn't get to go fly off again. So we go out, and this was kind of a bad weather thing, so the Navy has to go out, and they find a hole out in the middle of, the sea, and they're launching us, going in circles, launching the airplanes. So I go over to the captain, Captain Rollins, and I say, Jack needs to fly off. And they said, look, there's only minimum crew in this thing, but you can take Jack in your B-25. So we were able to take Jack, put him in the airplane. His whole family's there. It was kind of a sad deal because everybody wanted to see him go off, but he didn't make it. But he got to fly off in the B-25. So we became really good friends with Jack. And I think me and Alan, I think we were flying the Thunderbolt, the B-25, and Jack was going with us. We were going to go up, and I think we were up in the Bay Area. We take off from an air show, and we're flying around with him. This is the first time we really got to fly with him because his plane was broke all the time. And we're realizing Jack's not a bad pilot. He's actually a really good pilot. He can't hear. We're flying down the coast. We go over Hearst Castle, go down under the water, and he's lost all the time. And you're calling Jack, and you're saying, Jack, look, we're right above you. You know, he's down on the water. We pull down on him, and he's sitting in the cockpit smoking a cigarette, flying along. Hey, where are you guys at? You know, so anyway, long story short, he became a really good friend of ours, and then several years after that, he picked up the phone. We started maintaining the airplane for him in Rialto. And he picked up the phone and said, hey, you know, I want to come out and talk to you. And I said, oh, okay, what do we do this time, you know? And he comes out and he's saying, I want you guys to have my airplane. And I go, Jack, you know, we can't afford your airplane, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, I'm not giving it to you. And I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, well, I said, Jack, you got a problem? And he said, yeah. He said, I have some cancer issues. And he said, I'm not long in the world. And he said, I want you guys to have this airplane. So it has a big meaning to us because he was a World War II pilot. He, you know, did fly in the Battle of the Atlantic. We thought he was just an old guy, but now that we're his age of what he was now, I realize, you know what, you're still physically capable. You're thinking, he's an old guy. Well, I was 45 and he was 67 or something like that. And you're sitting here going, well, you know, it's a shame. But so there's a lot of meaning to the airplane for me and Alan and our partner, Chris. And that's why we wanted to be able to showcase and let it go fly today. So that's not going to happen. So if you guys want to, and we can talk Alan into it, we'll take it out and run it. Is it snowing out there still? You want to do it? You guys want to see it run? Okay. I would suggest while we're moving some of the stuff around, we still have the stand here. So if anybody does want to get up and see it, you know, I would rush over there and knock the person in front of you out of the way so you can get up there. And we'll get it out and run it. I hope you guys all enjoyed it. John did a great lecture. Thank you for everything.